Welcome to the Classical Liberal Arts Academy's Grammar 1 Latin Verb Mastery Program. In this first video, we'll study the first person indicative active forms. The first person indicative active forms. In this video, you will learn the first person indicative active forms for all four conjugations. In this video, you will learn the first person indicative active forms for all four conjugations. You can see them highlighted in red on the left. Take a moment and find these forms on your Latin verb summary chart. The first set of forms we're going to learn are the first person forms of the indicative mood for each tense. You can see them here highlighted in red. Take a moment and find this box on your Latin verb summary chart. You can see we're going to learn the first person singular form for the present tense, for the imperfect tense, for the future tense, for the perfect tense, and for the pluperfect tense of the indicative mood. The first person forms for each tense of the indicative mood in the first conjugation. Let's go ahead and get started. Since this is the first set of forms that we'll be learning, let's take a moment and make clear what we'll be doing. In this video, our focus will be on the first person singular forms for indicative active verbs. We're only studying the first person forms. The reason we're doing this is to give you a quick summary of the forms for each tense in each mood. This summary will be useful to you in the future for quickly identifying the forms of verbs that you see. Look at the title on this slide. You can see that we're looking at the first person indicative active verbs. We're only looking at the first person form for indicative active verbs. Furthermore, this screen shows the forms of the first conjugation verb amo, amare. In Lesson 30, you learned that there are four basic Latin verb conjugations, just as there were 5 basic Latin noun declensions. There are 4 verb conjugations. This screen shows the first person indicative active forms for the first conjugation. The example verb of the first conjugation is amo, amare. We know that amo, amare is a first conjugation verb because the second form, which is the infinitive form, ends in are. Any Latin verb that has an infinitive that ends in are is a first conjugation verb. Once we learn the forms for amo, amare, we will know the forms for any first conjugation verb. You'll see this screen again in the next slide, and we'll get started with our study. But make sure that you understand what we're doing in this first video, and that you follow along on your verb summary chart. The goal is to learn the verb summary chart. This video is just a guide. First person indicative active forms for the first conjugation verb amo, amare. In the present tense, I love, amo, I love, amo. Imperfect tense, I did love, amabam, I did love, amabam. Future tense, I shall love, amabo, I shall love, amabo. Perfect tense, I have loved, amavi, I have loved, amavi. Pluperfect tense, I had loved, amaveram, I had loved, amaveram. First person indicative active forms of the first conjugation verb amo, amare, to love. Be sure these are all memorized. Next, we're going to learn the first person indicative forms of the second conjugation. The example verb of the second conjugation is dokeo, dokere, to teach. You can see the forms we'll be learning highlighted in red. Find this box on your Latin verb summary chart and we'll begin. First person indicative active verbs. For the second conjugation, dokeo, dokere, to teach. First, of the present tense, I teach, dokeo. I teach, dokeo. Imperfect tense, I did teach, dokebam. I did teach, dokebam. Future tense, I shall teach, dokebo. I shall teach, dokebo. Perfect tense, I have taught, dokui. I have taught, dokui. Pluperfect tense, I had taught, dokueram. I had taught, dokueram. The first person indicative active verbs for the second conjugation verb dokeo, dokere, to teach. And now from Latin to English. First person indicative active verbs for the second conjugation verb dokeo, dokere, to teach. In the present tense, dokeo, I teach, dokeo, I teach. Imperfect tense, dokebam, I did teach, dokebam, I did teach. Future tense, dokebo, I shall teach, dokebo, I shall teach. Perfect tense, dokui, I have taught, dokui, I have taught. Pluperfect tense, dokueram, I had taught, dokueram, I had taught. First person indicative active verbs for the second conjugation verb dokeo, dokere, to teach. Now let's pause and take a look at what we've learned so far. You can see here in this chart that you've learned the first person singular forms for the indicative mood of the first and second conjugation. You've learned amo, amabam, amabo, amavi, amaveram. And you've learned dokeo, dokebam, dokebo, dokui, and dokueram. Now you can see how in future videos we'll go back and fill this in with the rest of the forms. But so far, you're learning a summary of each tense in each mood. So far, we've only worked on the indicative mood, but in future videos, we'll get into the other moods and continue working our way through the entire Latin verb summary chart. I'd like to take a moment to make an important point here. Verbs are made up of two basic parts, a stem and personal endings. The endings tell us something about the person and the number and the tense of a verb. But for the perfect and pluperfect tenses, and a number of other forms as well, verbs will use a different stem to show the tense. Look for example at amabam, the imperfect form of amare. In amabam, the stem is ama, and the ending is bam. Look at the future tense, amabo. The stem is ama. The ending is bo. Bo marks the future tense. Bam marks the imperfect tense. The stems are the same, ama. But if you look down to the perfect tense, we'll see something different. We have the word amavi. The ending is e. The stem is amav. The perfect stem, amav, is different from the stem of the present, imperfect, and future tenses, which was ama. This perfect stem must be memorized for every single verb you ever learn. Some verbs have very strange perfect stems. The stem of the perfect tense must be memorized for every verb. This is something to keep an eye on as we continue through our studies of verb forms. Now let's move to the third conjugation for the verb lego, legere, to read. We're going to learn the first person forms of the indicative mood for the third conjugation. You can see the forms we're going to learn highlighted in red in the box on your screen. Find this box on your verb summary chart and we'll begin. First person indicative active verbs for the third conjugation, using the verb lego, leggere, to read. In the present tense, I read, lego. I read, lego. Imperfect tense, I did read, legebam. I did read, legebam. Future tense, I shall read, legam. I shall read, legam. Perfect tense, I have read, legi. I have read, legi. And the pluperfect tense, I had read, legeram. I had read, legeram. The first person indicative active verbs for the third conjugation, lego, leggere, to read. In this slide, we'll move from Latin to English. The first person indicative active verbs for the third conjugation, lego, leggere, to read. In the present tense, lego, I read, lego, I read. Imperfect tense, legebam, I did read, legebam, I did read. In the future tense, legam, I shall read, legam, I shall read. In the perfect tense, legi, I have read, legi, I have read. And in the pluperfect tense, legeram, I had read, legeram, I had read. The first person indicative active verbs for the third conjugation, lego, leggere, from Latin to English. Now you can see that we've learned the first person singular forms for each tense of the indicative mood for the first, second, and third conjugation. You should be familiar with all of the forms in the red boxes on this screen. It's time for me to make another important point as we move through these forms, just so that you know the sort of things that you ought to be looking for as we work through these studies. We saw before that the sign of the future tense in the first and second conjugations was the ending bo. Here you can see that in the word dokebo, the ending bo is circled. That ending marks the future tense. However, in the third and fourth conjugations, they use a different ending to mark the future tense. Endings of the future tenses are different for third and fourth conjugation verbs. Endings of the future tenses are different for third and fourth conjugation verbs. Now let's move to the fourth conjugation. Here we'll study the first person forms of each tense of the indicative mood for the fourth conjugation verb audio, audire, which means to hear. You can see the forms we're going to learn highlighted in red in the box on your screen. Find this box on your verb summary chart and let's get started. First person indicative active verbs of the fourth conjugation for the verb audio, audire, to hear. In the present tense, I hear, audio. I hear, audio. Imperfect tense, I did hear, audiebam. I did hear, audiebam. In the future tense, I shall hear, audiam. I shall hear, audiam. Perfect tense, I have heard, audivi. I have heard, audivi. In pluperfect tense, I had heard, audiveram. I had heard, audiveram. The first person indicative active verbs of the fourth conjugation, audio, audire, to hear. And now the same forms from Latin to English. The first person indicative active verbs of the fourth conjugation verb audio, audire, to hear. In the present tense, audio, I hear. Audio, I hear. In the imperfect tense, audiebam, I did hear. Audiebam, I did hear. In the future tense, audiam, I shall hear. Audiam, I shall hear. In the perfect tense, audivi, I have heard. Audivi, I have heard. And in the pluperfect tense, audiveram, I had heard. Audiveram, I had heard. The first person indicative active verbs of the fourth conjugation verb audio, audire, to hear. You should now know the first person forms for all indicative active verbs. You should now know the first person forms for all indicative active verbs. We've studied each of the four conjugations, and you can see the boxes that we've learned highlighted in red. Find these on your Latin verb summary chart and make sure you understand what we've covered so far and what we have yet to cover. I hope that you've enjoyed this first video in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy's Latin Verb Mastery program. We've studied the first person indicative active forms. In our next videos, we'll continue this study.